Hello everyone, it's Hilary here, and I'm very delighted to see you come along today for this webinar, Restorative Practice. I'm going to be talking to Mark Finnis in a moment. He's going to give us an overview. But before we get started, I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping points with you. You won't see us. We're just going to provide you with a series of slides and some information and conversation around that. If you have any technical problems, if you have problems with your sound or vision or anything with your PC, then just switch off, come back in, log in as usual, and you'll be able to pick up where we're going on. And also just to remind you that we do record our webinars, so if you have a problem, then let us know and we can make sure you get a copy of the recording. So as I've said, I'm joined by Mark Finnis, and he's going to talk to us about restorative practice. And I just want to say at this point that in my last full-time position, when I was the behaviour lady, we had someone came in and gave us a talk about restorative justice, and although very interesting, and we tried to apply some of the thought process into our practice, but it's a bit different than the things that Mark is going to talk to us about today. So I'm very looking forward to hearing about that. So welcome, Mark. Thank you so much, and I'll just hand over to you now.
Hi, Hilary. Thanks for having me today. I'm really pleased to be here as well. Just thought it might be useful to introduce myself. So my name's Mark. I'm director of an organisation called L30, Relational and Restorative Systems. And we do a lot of work in education and in higher education as well. And I'm really delighted to be here to talk to you a little bit more about restorative practice. So, on the title slide, we're talking about working restoratively. So what I'd like to do is talk about the value of relationship and the power of working with, which is one of the key slides I'm going to talk you through today in terms of developing restorative practice. But I think restorative justice is really powerful, as Hilary said. But for me, when I started working in this way in about early 2000s, we did focus on restorative justice, maybe as a behaviour management strategy, but it's much more responsive. It focuses on repairing harm and repairing relationships when something's gone wrong. But I don't know about you, but why do we always wait for things to go wrong? So the first stage we talk about, which is different, is what would happen if we got involved earlier in the life of the problem, earlier in the life of the child, the young person, the young adult. And that's the difference between justice and practice. Is we want to be much more proactive, and we want to put a greater emphasis on the importance of anything that builds strong connections, develops a sense of community, and invest in relationships. But we still don't want to ignore the top stuff about repairing harm in relationships. And that's the important part for us, is that things move from a context of behaviour management more to a context of relationships. And that's what I'd like to explore a little bit more with you this morning, is that investment in relationships. Now, I don't think relationships are anything new to staff and to colleagues listening in today. I think the challenge is, how do we move that practice from implicit to explicit? In other words, we do it on purpose, we do it deliberately, and we do it creatively. Again, I think some people more naturally build relationships with students, with colleagues, with families, but we want to make this explicit, and restorative justice just focuses on the repair and the harm, whereas in restorative practice, we want to put a greater emphasis on the importance of building, maintaining, and repairing those relationships. And that's the bit, really, if we drill down a little further, for us, first and foremost, the importance, really, is about building strong connections. So the next phrase I'd love you to think about and just mull over as you're listening in is the importance of connect before content. I think the important bit for us is to invest really strong connection with our students, with our colleagues in terms of those parts. And we talk a lot about making regular deposits into the social capital bank. And when we talk about a social capital bank or relational capital or social capital theory, very simply today, if you just imagine them as a social capital bank between yourself and one of your students, or as I say, a colleague, is that we want to make not just one or two deposits into the social capital bank. We want to make hundreds. It could be a small deposit, a smile, eye contact. But it could be the next bit about really know our students well and know ourselves well, is the important bit for us around social capital. And I always think about three P's in relational stuff is around personal, private, and professional. So that the next phrase that I'm using about is know our students well and allow them to know us well is much more. We're not talking about sharing private things, but I want students to know I've got children, I support everything, I've got a dog called Dexter. But I don't want them to know private things or personal things rather. It's that important bit of really investing in strong, and we always say that small ripples create big waves and do the simple things well. And in terms of relationships, we're not asking people to consider doing things 100% better, rather 100 things 1% better. And that's the bit really is about how do you think our students to the class door. I think relationships are built in the corridors, in the team. And that's the powerful bit for us, and really, is that all we're talking about doing is starting to create much stronger investment in the social capital bank. So not just for connection, but also to think about developing a sense of belonging. And that's the bit for us, is that are your students passengers or part of the crew? Are they part of the audience or part of the class? Do they feel a sense of ownership around behaviour, around learning, around being young leaders? And that's the challenge really around that investment in that social capital bank. Is we want to put a huge investment in that sense of belonging. Potentially, to give you a couple more examples, we're talking about also possibly the language we use. Does it drive connection and belonging or disconnection? And I always say the language we use creates the reality we experience, and also potentially the language we use to describe an experience often becomes the experience. To give you a couple of examples, we say, student X is hard to reach, difficult to engage. For me, that puts all the blame to students. If we changed that and we said they've been able to build a relationship with student X, yes. We talk about some of that. I'm not having student X back in my lessons until he's ready to learn. Just some of that language for me doesn't build on that social capital and that relational capital bank. So we want to talk about some of those words, and I'm about to use the L word, so brace yourselves. I also think the word love gets a bad press sometimes. I think sometimes some students come to your establishment to learn. I think they do come to school to love. And I think sometimes some of our students are topped up with home. I'd love to think my own children get enough love at home. But just if you break that word love down, I'm thinking of getting push people off. Is that I'm not talking about home with my children, my family and friends, or even Everton football club. I'm talking about words like nurture, encouragement, compassion, empathy, listening, that wider sense. And just while I'm on this, it's brilliant work by Dr. Andrew Curran, who's based at Old Age Children's Hospital. He wrote a great book, The Little Book of the Brave. He talks about 7 steps for learning. And the 6th step is that children must experience a wider sense of love. And I think sometimes that often behaviour, especially when we look at stuff, we don't seek to understand, we seek to blame. And I think our ownership is that all behaviour is nothing more than a display of an unmet need. And how many of our children come to school displaying some of those unmet needs in ways that aren't helpful? And I think sometimes children need the most love when they deserve it the least, if that makes sense. The third part on there is to develop a sense of strong community. And that's really the big difference, I think, between practice and justice, is we want to put a huge emphasis on the in the investment of relationships, because I think if we get in it earlier in the life of the problem, things don't escalate, so students don't lose their placements, their colleges, or we don't have to exclude them, because we deal with things at a really small level. And that's the challenge for us really, is that there's a brilliant TEDx talk by Richard Pearson who uses the phrase that every child needs a champion, and adults who are rationally obsessed with them being successful. I absolutely love that phrase, rationally obsessed with them being successful. Dr. Brené Brown talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy. She says sympathy drives disconnection and empathy drives connection. So I think sometimes in terms of relationship, what is our language making? What is our behaviour improving some of those things? And where's our friendship? Because there's a graphic will have just come up on your screen. And some of you hopefully will have seen this, it's a little old school, but I still think there's a lot of benefits and value in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'm not going to take you through this. It's more of a just a glance up, and you can read much more of this online. And if you want to email me, I can send you this with some more posts and some more words around it. But if the third one up is around that sense of belonging, the relationship. According to Maslow, you must have the bottom one in place before you can get to the second one, before you can get to the third one. And how many of our students haven't got the bottom things in place? Their biological needs being met. There is things happening at home that causes them stress, anxiety, upset. It might be around things around feeling protective. Sadly, some of our students might be around complex situations in home lives where there might be misuse, there might be domestic violence, domestic abuse, and other things happening to them. Yet we expect them to build strong relationships and build self-esteem and move to that one around growth and self-actualization. I like to just explore this slide a little, and that's why I wanted to drop it in this morning, because I think it'd be naive on my part to acknowledge that some of our students might find it tough to build those relationships if the bottom two aren't in place. And that's the bit really where that very simple line of all behaviour is nothing more than a display of an unmet need. I think sometimes it's the bottom two in place, and the more we know our students well and they know us well, essentially we get involved early in the life of that problem because of those bits. And that's the bit where we talk about engagement, is that I think it comes in three forms: physical, emotional, and mental. You might have a student who's physically engaged in your lesson, they're sat at their table. Are they emotionally or mentally engaged? And I think everything starts with a relationship, and relationships are the oxygen of human development. And that's the quote from Rita, really. It's just to put it up for a moment. And I didn't read you out that line, that's on there. I just thought at that point I was talking. It's that bit around TEDx talk, you can add the word eventually obsessed. But I think a lot of what I've talked about so far is probably just common sense. But we always say that common sense isn't always that common. Does everybody you work with actually even like children and young people? Are they passionate about their children or passionate about subjects? I think most people are passionate about their children and young people and young adults. I think the challenge for us is to move it from implicit to explicit. I think sometimes in behavior management and in our systems, which could be policies and procedures, sometimes we do things because we've always done them that way. Didn't Einstein say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results? The slide in front of you says tradition just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean it's not incredibly stupid. I think we do things because we've always done it that way. And you even think about fear of suspension. For me, I think punishment by itself just creates resentment rather than reflection. Quick example for you: how many of you, when you were in school, ever got put on detention? So the child was sent to your bedroom at home. I bet you never thanked people for the teachable moment and the learning opportunity to grow. I bet you got resentful. So we're not saying there shouldn't be consequences for people's actions in restorative practice, but what we are saying is that a lot of what we do is based on tradition. And if you look up some research in teams, for example, it talks about that punishment sanctions are only up to 20% effective, when actually logical consequences are up to 70% effective. So that's the bit I talked to you a little bit towards the end about changing the conversation to create consequences that are done with people, but more importantly, are logical to what happens rather than imposed upon people. But some of that change requires energy. Doing things differently might feel uncomfortable. And if you're listening in and you're willing to humour me for a moment, just fold your arms for me. And if you manage to do it, just fold your arms the opposite way and hold them there for a second or two. And just think, is that more or less comfortable? I bet for most of you that feels slightly uncomfortable. So if it does feel uncomfortable, please go back to what feels comfortable. But that small change of folding your arms a different way can feel uncomfortable. For some people, working restoratively can feel uncomfortable because it's a break from tradition. And again, sometimes working restoratively, I think it requires a little courage. Because the question sometimes I ask people, which is a more complex question in some ways, but is, do we manage risk or do we suppress opportunity? Do we exclude some of our young people and young adults from our colleges, from our higher education, from our schools, because it's an easier way to manage some of that risk? There's an African proverb, though, that says that if we exclude our young people from our village, they'll come back and burn it down to feel its warmth. Now, I hope you hear what I hear in that statement, that the challenge is about how do we remain inclusive, value-driven and relational-driven even when things are going wrong. And that's the bit for me in restorative practice. It creates a framework for me to be able to hang my practice on. It gives us a framework to be able to provide consistency across the college, across your higher education, and when we work in schools. But I always say that, there's no equality in treating everybody equal. So a great colleague and friend of mine, Dave Whittaker, talks about flexible consistency. That goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the relational stuff. If you know your students well, your young people, your young adults, then you can be flexible in your approach, or consistent in your approach, but flexible in terms of the outcomes. And that's the challenge for us, really, in terms of restorative practice. So I think the next slide gives us a really simple way to be able to start to manage and articulate those relationships in a really simple way. So this is a great piece of work by the references on the bottom. It's in use of permission and adapted from a piece of work by Ted Wachtell and Paul McColl. They adapted it from a model by Malcolm Blazer, and I think you might recognise themes of it from Johari's Window, Situational Leadership, and other parts. But if I can just explain the two axes first, the one going across around where it says support, if we break that down a little further, what we mean by support is nurture, encouragement, compassion, empathy, listening. We don't mean necessarily packages of support, more the words I've just used. If we think about the axes going up around the word challenge, we mean things like to set limits, to set boundaries, to have expectations, discipline sanctions, consequences, a very clear bottom line. If we use things like danger statements, and what we mean by that is I'm feeling really concerned when you do X, but making sure we separate the deed from the doer, the act from the actor, so we still value the person while still challenging that behaviour. But we call it four ways of being. The original version is called the social discipline window. The reason we call it four ways is I think you've got four ways in which you choose to practice, whether that's explicit or implicit, and spend time in each of these boxes. So if I ask you to focus on the top left box to start with, which is the high challenge but really low on support, even just to take 10 seconds as I'm talking, what words would you use to describe that style of practice? Someone who sets limits, sets boundaries, expectations are high, defaults to punishment sanctions, they're very low on support, so they're not offered any nurturing, encouragement or compassion. Words that come up when we do this on training courses is words like strict, harsh, authoritarian, and controlling. Some students, when we do this work with students, just use words like scary, nervous, scared to ask a question. But I also think there's some good qualities in this box. Maybe in small doses, but this person there is boundaries, there is limits. But we have a word to describe this style of practice, and it's the word is doing things to people. The original version has the word punitive and authoritarian. We simplify it slightly. Is that somebody who's high on challenge and low on support, they tend to impose decision making or impose punishment upon people. So they do things to people. If you go across to the bottom right hand box now, in terms of high support, low on challenge, I guess the other side of the coin to the two box. This is a style of practice where there's really high levels of support, nurture, encouragement, and compassion, but they couldn't set a boundary for coffee. There's really low expectations. Again, take a few seconds to think about what words would you use to describe that style of practice. High on support, but low on challenge. Words on courses that we often hear are words like bit of a pushover, soft touch, but they care. They offer nurture, they offer encouragement, they're a listener. I suppose a more challenging word to descriptors might be they rescue people, they make excuses. They're not so good at holding people to account. Some students on occasion say this style of practice in the bottom right feels a little unsafe. They're not sure what's expected of them. There isn't the boundaries and the limits. But we call this style of practice, as it's coming up, the for box. In other words, we do a lot of things for people. I think, if I'm being really honest, doing things to people just creates compliance without ownership. I mean, just an example to bring that to life for the two box, and then I'm going to come back to the four box. Is in the two box, that compliance without ownership. I think it's a little bit like when you see people driving with speed cameras. You know, you approach those white lines on the floor, and you see other drivers who might start to brake, and then the minute they get past those white lines on the floor, they speed up a little bit, and they're only compliant between certain moments. I think that style of practice in the two box and the work we do with our children, young people, and families, and across the colleges and higher education, is that the students will only behave in that way when we're around, but when we're not, they go back to what they've always done. They haven't got the intrinsic motivation to do it. The four box potentially is, in terms of being overly supportive, if we end up doing too many things for our students, who do they come back to next time they've got a problem or they need help? I think doing things for people potentially leads to dependency. Students become dependent on the services we provide. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do some things for people or some things to people, but those two boxes for us is potentially the boxes we default to when things aren't going our way. The bottom left box you'll see in red is the style of practice where somebody's low on support but low on challenge. In other words, they're not doing much of either. Again, just take a few seconds to think about what words would you use to describe that style of practice. Words on courses we often get is somebody who's not as interested, doesn't care, maybe the wrong job. Equally though, some of the other words are they might be stressed, tired, burnt out, not well themselves. Potentially though, in terms of that word, we call this the not box. The original version has the word neglectful. Now I want to be clear, we're not saying that when people are tired, stressed, overwhelmed or burnt out, they're neglectful. But potentially they need a little more support or they need a little more challenge to get out of that box. Because I actually think that's the dangerous box. The last box that's left for us to explore excuse me, is the high challenge, high support box in the green box. Again, just think about what words would you use to describe that style of practice of somebody who's high on challenge, they set limits, they set boundaries, they're clear with what they expect. They do hold people to account, but they do that within a continuum of support, nurture, encouragement, compassion, and empathy. Words that comes up on courses that we do are words like collaborative, relational, still authoritative too. They also, when we work with students, they talk about words like you know what's expected, they're interested in you, they want to help. They also say it's not comfortable all of the time. The level of expectations are really high on the challenging activities, but they get their needs met with the support activities. The word that we use to describe that style of practice is the with box. And the green box, the with box, the original version has the word restorative, it has the word relational, and it has the word authoritative. Now, the reason I use that word last is I think some people think restorative practice is really in the four box. The reality is restorative practice gives you the framework to be really explicit about a high challenge, high support model. But what that means is we need to do things with people rather than to them or for them. And in the original version developed by Ted Wachtell and Paul McColl, they have a really nice line to sum it up that says when people in positions of authority do things with people rather than to them or for them, people are most likely to cooperate. People are more likely to want to change. You're going to take people with you. I think when we do things to people and for people and it's not, how does that affect the relational stuff we have in place? Does it create behaviour change, or do we keep getting the same things over and over again? The power of restorative practice is that we start to do things with people rather than through them or for them. I haven't used this as a parent, so if anyone's listening who's got children, this is a great parent model in 4 ways. If you're a leader of a large college or organisation or school or anything, you want the framework to be able to be a leader. I mean, I could keep going through professions. Even as a parent, if any of you've got children, I remember when one of mine was young and they were learning to tie shoelaces. You know, Sunday afternoon, we've got all the time in the world, and I'm banging the whiz box. We're setting some boundaries. We've got some music on, and I'm teaching my son to tie shoelaces. So we've got him there. Monday morning, the boundary's set. You're going to do your own shoelaces, baby. I'm banging the whiz box with him. But after a couple of minutes of me saying, you know, I'm not helping, the boundaries strong on the challenging activities, but I'm giving them lots of nurturing, encouragement and compassion with my tone of voice, saying, look how great you're doing, baby, I'm really impressed, you're doing wonderful. I then look at my watch and realise I'm running late because I'm doing work too as well. I default to the toolbox. So my language changes, my non-verbals change, and I start to do things too. Will you get a move on? Hurry up. You don't know my son, but he starts to panic then because actually all of the supportive elements have gone and I'm now doing to him. Even worse, you look at your watch again a minute, moment or two later and you realise you really are running late now to get to work and to drop him off. So I go to the floor box and what do? Yeah, you're right. I do his laces up for him. He's driving him at the moment. Even worse, another example might be I go to the knock box and we bought the Velcro. So I practice in all 4 boxes with a little boy who I love to bits, who loves me to bits, and I still can't remain in the whiz box when I'm short of time and under pressure. For those of you listening in, how many times in your busy day are you short of time and under pressure? So the challenge is, how do we work in the whiz box even when things aren't going our way? Because most of us have a default position. When everything's going my way, I can work in the whiz box all day long. The challenge is when things or people don't want to work with me. You end up going to the 2 box to make people do things, or you go to the 4 box and you do it for them because at least you know it's been done. And even worse in the 4 box, at least you know it's been done properly. The challenge is, how do we move that implicit practice I've mentioned a couple of times with very explicit? What would happen in your organisation if everybody moved more towards the whiz box rather than do things to people or for people? What would the results be in terms of student engagement and retention? What would the outcomes and impact be around teaching and learning? What would the impact be for staff if there was real consistency across your organisation? What would that be like? If you want to get in touch with me, I can share some data from organisations around, you know, some of the outcomes and impact and data stuff that might be of interest to you. If I move on a little further, I think when there's conflict and tension, because I've talked a lot, so I just want to move on to a little bit around managing conflict and tensions. If we go back to the second slide in your head, I talked about build, maintain, and repair. I've talked a fair bit about building and maintaining relationships in restorative practice. I'd like to talk about when relationships break down. I always say there's always more than one perspective. At first glance at that picture, some of you might have to second look, second guess until you realise there was a mirror on the front of that bar. I think when things go wrong, if we're not careful, the adult perspective becomes the truth. But the reality is, we say there's only 3 truths: my truth, your truth, and the truth. And that's the challenge for us, is how do we start to seek to understand rather than seek to blame? And Stephen Covey's got a really powerful quote in his book, 7 Steps to Highly Effective People. He says most people don't listen with the intent to understand, they just listen with the intent to reply. He also says the way we see the problem is the problem. I think those quotes are really powerful. So when things go wrong, there might be more than one perspective, would you agree? So the next picture, some of you will see it facing towards you, some of you might see it, facing off towards the side, some of you might even see a flick between the two. And that's the bit, is perspectives can change. The way we first seen it, the second time might be slightly different. And before we move to the next slide, is can you have the same situation but people see it from totally different perspectives. And that's the bit in restorative practice, that if we move things from a context of systems, policies, and procedures to a context of relationships, then that's the challenge for us really around some of those things. And what we've done around this bit, part of our organisation L30, is create a very simple language structure around when relationships are broken down, there's some conflict and tension. A very simple structure. I want to talk to you today about this as the last part of the slides. And there's much more to it than this. You know, we deliver a lot of training to really help people understand the whole language structure and the complexity of restorative language. This is just some of the restorative questions. There's much more on effective statements and some of the elements of the Milton language model on presuppositions and using language really properly. We do a lot of work on non-verbals and preparation and preparing for conversations. But I just thought today it gives us an opportunity to share something more with you. Is that sometimes I have a couple of phrases as well as that strike when the iron's cold. Sometimes we become reactive rather than thinking about where's my emotional regulation at and where's theirs at. So we talk about using restorative processes at the right time, in the right place, to the right degree. But again, this is where this differs from restorative justice to restorative practice. Is restorative justice is those large, formal, structured models. Most people think, I know very skilled people use it in everyday situations. But restorative practice is about having those restorative chats, corridor conversations, the back of a classroom, chat over lunch, very small processes, but still up to those large processes that we call restorative conferences. I suppose these three steps that I'm about to take you through, but I want to just engage you in this, is that when things go wrong in your establishment, do you spend more time focusing on problems or more time focusing on solutions? Do you spend time in the past or in the future? Do we build on strengths or weaknesses, gifts or deficits? You know, I also have a phrase of captain getting it right more than you captain getting it wrong. But these three little bubbles, just to move things on a touch, is that the first bubble on there is all about what's happened. We call it the storytelling phase, but you can call it people sharing their account or their perspective. I want to break these three bubbles down, but I want to cover them first. The second bubble is the one I think we don't do as much. What was the impact on people and relationships? In other words, who's been affected by what's happened? The third bubble is all about solutions. What needs to happen next? And this is not a script, it's the structure for holding a relational, restorative conversation with people. So it could be not what needs to happen now, what needs to happen next, what needs to happen in this afternoon's meeting to move things forward. You'll also notice the timeline on there, which I'm going to come back to in a second or two. But if I break the first bubble down a little further, that question, what happened, looks very simplistic, but it allows everybody to share their unique perspective. I think a question we often ask when things have gone wrong is the why question. Now, the why question is one that I think builds brick walls between people rather than bridges. It slams the door shut on communication rather than open up windows of opportunity. Also, if you've ever asked anybody the why question, their response is usually a shrug of the shoulders, they get defensive, they feel blamed. It's also a high functioning question, why? Whereas we think if you break the question down into three phases of what happened, you'll notice some thinking questions and some feeling questions on that slide in front of you. The order for a restorative conversation is asking people their view of what's happened, what were they thinking, and how were they feeling. Now, we don't ask those questions by accident. We ask those questions on purpose. And also, if you remember the timeline from the previous slide, we're also talking about using what was happening before that, what was happening after that. At the time, what were your thoughts? But sitting here today, what do you think about what happened? When that happened, how are you feeling? Or how are you feeling now? That's the timeline. We want people to replay their story, but if they were having conflict and tensions with somebody else, we want other people to hear their unique perspective. There's an emotional component to memory, so those thinking questions are engaging in different parts of the brain. And the reason we ask the feeling question isn't just because, oh, it's nice for people to share how they feel. There's some theories out there, again, keeping it quite simplistic today, but it's that if you express it, you feel it, and if you feel it, you're ready to move on. So that's why we ask the three questions. The second bubble along is who's been affected. Again, just have a little think, but when we ask who's been affected, quite a lot of the time, the first person people say is themselves, but we're ready for that if you have a look on the slide. Question up there towards the top right is to tell us how you've been affected. But the one beneath it broadens it out, but who else might have been affected? What was the impact on other people? I think if you drop a pebble in the pond, the ripples go out much further. So other people have been affected. This is the bit back to the context of relationships rather than systems. The third bubble is we want to move things on to the future. Again, just have a little think. Can you change the past? I don't think you can. But can you change the future? I think sometimes the meetings we spend the bulk of the meeting talking about problems with a rush bit on a solution. In restorative practice, we want to spend more time thinking about what needs to happen next to prevent a reoccurrence. And some of those extra questions around the outside, not just on this slide, but the previous two, is just to give you some help and some suggested questions. There's 41 questions on this slide. We're not saying they're all the right ones, but the characteristics are really important. They're open questions. They're not taking sides. They're asking people to explore. They're thinking, feeling, and practical in terms of what happens. Giving everybody a voice. But those three bubbles, for me, might need to be shortened in a corridor conversation. Just ask people what happens and what needs to happen next. It could be that you conflict with a couple of students or more, or some staff and students. We work around the two bubbles with everybody first, asking everybody to share their view of what happened, thoughts and feelings, and who's been affected. Once you've gone round absolutely everybody, giving them lots of time to talk, then we go round everybody else again, asking them what needs to happen now or next. Sometimes, again, we're just talking to you a little bit about an introduction to restorative practice today. But we talk a lot about 3Ps for the success of a more formal, sensitive conversation. If the 3Ps are preparation, preparation, preparation. There is a risk of bringing people face to face when relationships are broken down. So we want to work with people in the preparation before we bring people together. And if you think about where I was about 25 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, is when I said get involved earlier in the life of the problem. I think if we wait for things to go wrong, they become much more complex. They take a lot more time to prepare and they take a lot more time to facilitate. Whereas if you get involved earlier in the life of the problem, earlier in the life of the student, then things can be really powerful. And I think what we're modeling here is a process that can give our students life skills in everything we've talked about as the way they manage their own relationships. And if you think about dialogue and communication, we need to create the conditions in this conversation so people listen to each other. But quite often people say, oh, these are difficult conversations. But I always ask, do they have to be? I do think sometimes there's no easy way to poke people in the eye. It stings a little bit, but it gets better. The challenge is where's the culture in your own organisation? I always think that culture exists in every organisation, but is yours by design or by default? So that challenge around the language as well for us as adults. I think if we're not modelling what we're teaching something different. And that's the challenge for us really. And Gandhi said we must be the change we want to see in the world. Martin Luther King also said you don't have to be able to see the whole staircase, you just need to be willing to take the first step. These three bubbles in a restorative conversation isn't about creating a scene from Mary Poppins or Happy Days if you're as old as me. It's about focusing more on solutions than problems. You don't need to see that at the beginning. You just need to be willing to sit down with people to explore what happened, the impact on each other, and what needs to happen next. The slide in front of you now, we'll talk a little bit about spending more time in the future. And I think if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at start to change. And that's where, for me, we want to spend more time on the future and less time in the past.
Well, my goodness me, Mark, thank you. There is so much in there that you've covered. I just want to recap on a couple of things because, first of all, I really like to think right at the beginning, you said 100 things do them 1% better. So that means small steps, small changes can lead to bigger changes, can't they? You know, you don't have to go in full on making these relationship changes. You can just do small things that make a big difference, is what you're trying to say, isn't it? Um,
Yeah.
you know, also, I just wanted to say that you've very generously given 3 handouts, haven't you, which people can have copies of. One is that 4-way chart with the challenge, you know, the arrows on it. Another one is the 99 reasons, and I've just had a quick look at that again. And the 99 reasons handout is all the positives about reasons for change, how you can change, different things to do, bite-sized. And the other one, the other handout you've offered is the about building relational schools, restorative practice. So, wow, just so much there. The language, flipping your language. I love the picture of the bull run. Your expression there is just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean we've always got to do it that way. And that's so true. I mean, it was absolutely, especially people that have spent a lot of time in their professional practice, you sort of think, well, that's the way I do it. Well, actually, you have to change the way you do it sometimes because different people need something different, don't they, from your, if you're a teacher, that you particularly need to be aware of relationship and how it can be fractured so easily, can't it? And how to make those changes. Look, just a point here, everyone who's still online, we have had some problems with consistency of quality of sound during that, but stick with it. And if you've, you know, if you're thinking you didn't pick up bits and pieces, then go back across the recording when you get it, because there'll be bits in there that you might want to go back over the slides and remember what Mark said. So I just want to say thank you again very much, Mark, for coming along and sharing with us some of those absolute nuggets of thinking that people really ought to be doing. And just to let everybody know that if you want Mark to come into your school or college and do some work with you, then this is what you see on the screen, his contact information. And I'm sure you'll be able to sort something out with him or one of his colleagues to come in and work with your teams this way. And follow him on Twitter, obviously. And that's all we need to do for today. I just wanted to remind everyone that the upcoming Can Do Conversations, we're going to be doing an overview of how to understand or make head or tail of an EHCP. So if you have a student that is with you and you get given a load of paperwork and you don't know what it means, we'll help you to unravel it. You won't be an expert, but we'll be able to tell you exactly what you're seeing. And we're going to do a session on personal assertiveness, and this can extend to assertiveness in the classroom, but it will be in all areas of your life. So I hope you'll be able to join us again. So just to recap, thank you again very much, Mark, for coming along today. Here are our contact details. If you want to get in touch, this is the way to do it. I hope you have a very good rest of the day. And that's me, Hilary, signing off. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.